Hey guys, what's up? It's Doublezug. So I'm just going to do a quick video here of like advanced disciplined priest tips for Cataclysm. A lot of the stuff I'm going to mention in this video is like some of it's scattered throughout my various guides and boss guides and stuff like that, but I figured I'd just sort of condense it all into one spot and make a quick video with everything. So this is going to be like little min-maxy stuff that you can do on your priest once you've mastered all like the basics, just to get a little bit more out of your spells. So we're going to start with Palm. A couple of things with Palm here. What I would recommend is tracking this on your raid frames. You can see here in my raid frames, I have it tracked in the upper left, stacks as well as duration. Just useful to see where it is so that you can see if it's stuck, bounces to a pet, that kind of thing, and as well as just, you know, seeing how many stacks it has left. I'd also recommend having a weak aura that will tell you, I have a weak aura here it's actually just like a jury-rigged version of one of Foji's like Wrath weak auras that will just give me a sound cue when either the palm completely falls off or expends all of its charges. So the biggest thing with Palm that I'd recommend is just not casting it unless either your Palm is stuck somewhere where it's obviously not going to bounce, or until all the charges have been expended. The more charges that you use on your Palm, the more healing per cast and healing per mana the Palm actually does. So if you only let it bounce once or twice, it's like not even really worth casting for the most part. So you really want to get like 3, 4, or 5 bounces out of your Palm. The other thing to mention with Palm is that you should cast it into mechanics that tick, so like debuffs that do damage, AoE, like if you can see that certain people are standing in fire, you know, a lot of this stuff is going to be tracked on your raid frames, right? So you see a couple people are standing in a mechanic, just send your Palm into them because you can be assured that it's going to bounce if people are taking damage from environmental effects. So just keep in mind that Palm is like a conditional spell, and the better you aim it and the better you let it tick and let it bounce and track it, the more healing it's going to do. So that's Palm. Let's go to our big hitter, right? So POH, Prayer of Healing. So this is a big one. It's also a kind of a finicky, weird spell, right? It's group casted. It has like a radius as well as a range. So there's a lot of different things you can do with POH to try to maximize it. So one of the things I'll mention here that's kind of important actually and a little bit counterintuitive is just don't cast POH into the lowest, most in danger member of the group. So this goes for a lot of casted big heals, especially those with long cast times. A lot of the times what will happen if you cast it on like the lowest health target is that if they die in the cast time, you lose the entire value of the spell, and you get like massively opportunity costed, right? Because you've just spent 1 or 2 seconds casting a spell that does 0 healing. And then not only that, but like you could have been casting that spell on somebody else, so then maybe they'll die and you get this sort of cascading death effect. And especially with Prayer of Healing, given that it heals the entire group, you actually want to cast it either on somebody who's like the safest person in the group, right? Who's like not going to die in the cast time. And then it'll still heal the other damage players in the group anyways if it goes off. And you also, of course, want to be casting on people who are like centrally located, right? So there's another trick here to try to get somebody central located, which is that if you have a fight where the players are like loosely spread around melee, you can actually move melee into the ranged groups, like one melee into the ranged group, and then cast POH off them to splash onto everybody more effectively. You can also like purposely position yourself centrally so that you can POH off yourself onto the healer group. Things like that. A lot of your POHs are going to be going into the melee or into the ranged if they're actually stacked. POH does get considerably weaker if it's cast into a ranged group where it's not going to hit all 5 targets. You can also use your pre-pull time, so like when everybody's in their position and the boss is about to get pulled, you can like POH different people just to see how many targets you get hit, and you can also like try to ask people to rearrange to be closer to their group members, stuff like that. If you want to actually fully min-max that POH. Also, hunters or demons, don't target them. This is true for a lot of like AoE healing in the game, especially in Classic where hunters have that dead zone, right? Hunters are usually not going to be perfectly in the stack. They're going to be like off a couple yards away. So even like on H-Pal, you know, you shouldn't be radiancing onto hunters, you shouldn't be F-flowing onto hunters, chain healing off of hunters, stuff like that, because it's much more likely that they're not going to splash onto as many people as if you just gas it onto a ranged or a melee that's more likely to actually be into the stack. So hunters, ironically enough, also kind of take a lot of damage in Cata because they don't really have like passive mitigation, self-healing, or like really defensive cooldowns that are that good. So it's kind of a catch-22, right? Hunters take a lot of damage, but they're also not great targets for splash healing. The other thing to mention is that POH does hit pets. So you know, you can get a little bit of free value off of healing pets. Although pets don't take very much damage in Cataclysm, so this is pretty minor. Just something to keep in mind, though. The third thing to mention here is you can see on my raid frames I have Divine Aegis track here, and then I also have the Prayer of Healing Hot from the Glyph, which does 20% of the value over 6 seconds. And if you're really min-maxing and there's like taking damage on the whole raid, you shouldn't be POHing the same group within 6-second window, because you want to be getting that 20% value out of this hot. It's not super important. Like if one group is really dying, you can like double POH into them just to prevent death, but it's worth to mention that you can get some value out of like swapping between groups. And if you alternate between 3 groups, as long as your cast time's like over 2 seconds, which it should be, right, in this level of gear, 3 groups will always give your hot time to tick. Although I think it is worth just tracking on your raid frames. There's so few things we have to track as disc, so few hots that there's plenty of room on your raid frames to track stuff like that. Also, every dead player makes POH considerably worse. Try not to cast POH into groups where there's dead players, because every dead player is one less target that your PH will hit, right? So this one weakness of Disc Priest is that the more players die, the worse your healing gets. The last thing I'll mention here is that POHing into tank groups. So if you have like both of your tanks, main tank and off tank, and they're both taking damage, or like on a fight like Half-Is where you might even have 3 tanks all taking damage in range of each other, POHing into that group is going to be pretty efficient because it's going to heal both tanks effectively. So you're going to get 2 hits, they won't overheal. You're going to get all the Aegis shielding, and then especially if the Aegis shielding that splashes onto the 3 other melee in the tank group is not going to be overhealing. POH is actually like kind of a decent tank heal, ironically enough. So that's POH. Let's move on to Atonement. So Atonement, obviously our damage to healing. So this includes Holy Fire, Smite. What I'll mention here is that you should try not to cast Smite when Holy Fire isn't on the target. This Glyph of Smite increases smite damage by 20% when the Holy Fire dot is on the target. And of course, the Holy Fire dot is just a little bit of damage over time that like ticks every second for 6.77 seconds, so about 7 seconds. So you usually can get like 3 smites off inside of this window, which is enough to fully stack your evangelism also. So outside of this window, when you don't have like all those modifiers affecting your smite damage, smite is like a pretty bad spell, honestly. It costs more mana than Holy Fire. It's considerably longer cast time and does like 40% less damage, plus it doesn't have this hot. Smite is actually quite bad. But you really should try to be minimizing the amount of smites you cast that 1, don't give you evangelism stacks, 2, aren't in that, Holy Fire window, and 3, aren't on the boss if the boss has some sort of damage taken increased, right? Like Half-Is, or like if you're in the Energizer puddle on robots. The other thing to mention is the macros. I have these macros in my UI video that I'll link below. So just a simple like cast, brackets, target harm exists, close brackets, and then like empty open and close brackets here, and then Holy Fire or Smite. This will just make sure that whatever you're targeting, whether it be a friendly or the boss, it will just always cast Holy Fire and Smite on the boss. And it's just kind of a quality of life thing there, not too big of a deal. Another little min-max thing you can do with Atonement is try not to be in Atonement range of the boss. You can see that what Atonement does is if it heals you, the effect is reduced by 50%. So ideally, like if the whole raid's in a stack by the boss, you want to be like a little bit far out. Sometimes you have to be in Atonement range of the boss, but if you can possibly not be, just try to be just barely outside of the range of this, because if it does end up bouncing to you, 50% is a pretty big reduction, right? And you can always like pop a shield on yourself or cast a binding heal if you drop, which is going to be better than having that Atonement bounce to you. The other thing I'd mention is try to press your Archangel just like on CD. Gives you pretty big healing buff, and the mana is also really nice. So try to just like, be using your Holy Fire on cooldown, weaving in a couple smites to get that evangelism stacked all the way, and then just try to be basically pressing this on CD. You really only want to be holding this if there's like a big burst of damage coming up in 10-15 seconds. You can hold it and press it for that. Also, sending it with like 3 or 4 stacks isn't always the worst thing, especially if you're in like a really high damage phase and you don't really want to be smiting. So you can just send this with 3 or 4 in an emergency and go back to like POHing and casting your more efficient and high throughput heals. The other thing I'll mention is try not to let your evangelism stacks drop. This shouldn't really be happening because, again, Holy Fire is a very good spell and you should be casting it pretty regularly. And if you just cast your Holy Fire on cooldown or close to on cooldown, you won't ever drop those evangelism stacks. And again, Holy Fire is way better than Smite. So try to maximize your Holy Fire and minimize your Smite casts. Next, what we're going to talk about is Binding Heal. So Binding Heal is actually like a pretty powerful spell. It costs the same amount of mana as Flash Heal, but does like almost double the healing, right? Because it's on you and the other target. So what you can do here is, I know a lot of priests they don't have this in their brain to always be thinking about this. So what you can do is you can just make like a quick weak aura. So let's do that right now. Alright, so what I've done here is I've just made a really quick, super quick weak aura just to give an example of like what I mean by this. So I just had this trigger when my health is below 70%, and what this is going to do is, let's take some fall damage here. Hopefully this doesn't kill me. That would be ironic. So you can see here, take a bunch of fall damage, and this, why is it showing 8-hour duration? That's very strange. Get rid of that text. Yeah, that's it's very strange that it's showing 10 hours duration. I just have this set up to show the binding heal icon when I'm below a certain health threshold. So you can make a weak aura like this if you want to, just to help you like have it in your brain to remind you to use the spell. Binding heal is like pretty strong, it's high throughput, and it's like pretty decently mana efficient as well. If you find yourself never using this, you're playing like a little bit incorrectly. It's not a huge deal, but it's one to try to weave in there, and it will really increase your skill as a priest if you just think about this button more. Also, again, like POH is bad when there's a lot of players dead. In like super emergencies where the raid's taking a bunch of damage and like there's players dead and it's kind of like a big panic mode, you can spam binding heal if you have a decent amount of mana. You know, power word shield on really low targets, binding heal if you have damage taken on yourself, and it's usually better than flash heal in those circumstances, I find. So that's binding heal. Let's delete this weak aura really quick because it's I don't know why it's doing that. Let's go to Borrowed Time. So Borrowed Time is our talent here that gives us a little bit of a haste buff after we power word shield. You can see I have it tracked, my weak auras here. Just try to maximize this by, when you have that buff, Penance, as well as your instant spells, do not consume the buff, but they will benefit from the haste. So there's a couple of big things you can do here, which is just try to, after you power word shield, usually it's going to be on the tank, right? Just be extra vigilant for a good penance target and a good palm target after you use that power word shield, and if there are good targets, cast them before you cast another passive heal. The other thing to mention here is that you should just always be power word shielding before you hymn, because that hymn will benefit from that 14% haste. And if you stack that with Bloodlust, with Berserking, PI, you can get really big juicy hymns. Zerk PI plus this is like 50% haste, something crazy like that. So you can get really big him with having like no haste on your gear. So I have like 300 haste rating, and I can still him with like 50% haste or whatever with just self buffs. So that's Borrowed Time again, just kind of a small thing. Let's talk about Rapture. A couple things to mention with Rapture here. This is a really high priority for just regenerating your mana, right? It's huge. Keeping this on CD is very important. There's a bunch of weak auras out there on Wago that you can grab to do this. I have these weak auras that I have are posted on my UI video. I have a slightly modified version of the one that was in the Foji's Wrath pack. What this does is just shows the cooldown of Rapture, as well as giving me a little bit of a text-to-speech message that just says Rapture when it goes off cooldown, because I like these sound alerts and I like the text-to-speech. Anything that will help you... Oops. Fell off. Anything that will help you keep your Rapture on CD is like really important. You should be like looking at your logs and looking at priests that have like that are parsing highly with same kill times as you and trying to get your Rapture mana restored to like as high as they have. The other thing is, sometimes your Rapture like can get desynced with your weakened soul on the tank, and this can be kind of annoying and can cause you to kind of like sit there with your Rapture off CD for like 5-6 seconds sometimes, which is pretty bad, right? So if that desync does happen, there's a couple things you could do, right? The biggest one is just not to just keep it desynced, and try to proc your Rapture on somebody else. So there's a couple ways you can do this, right? Just, on somebody who has a debuff, maybe the off tank, somebody who's standing in fire, and you can also just put a Rapture on yourself. Like imagine this fire is like actually dealing damage. I can put a shield on myself and just stand in the fire until the shield breaks, and then pop out of it, just for the mana restore, which is, it's not like the greatest thing to be doing is to purposely be putting on yourself, but it is a little bit mana positive, and it can help you like resync your weak soul and your Rapture on the tank, which is kind of important. The other little thing to mention is just like, if you can, line up your gloves, any like int buffs, int procs with Rapture. Also your mana hymn. Obviously your mana hymn is going to restore a little bit of mana, but it also gives you that mana pool buff, right? So this maximum mana increased by 15%. This is also going to increase the Rapture mana you get by 15%. Try to get a Rapture proc after you mana him. That's Rapture. Let's talk about Aegis. Again, I'd recommend tracking Aegis on your raid frames, and trying not to let, like, if you can, just avoid this timing out. You can always refresh it and add to the stack by POHing. So if it's feasible to, if you have 4 or 5 like decently sized Aegis shields on a group, just refresh it with POH. Even if the POH is like mostly overhealing, it's usually worth it. So that's Aegis. Mana Hymn, let's talk about Mana Hymn. So again, Mana Hymn, as I've just mentioned, will give you that mana pool increase, which is actually like really nice for a number of things, right? It's going to increase your Rapture mana, increase your Replen mana, increase your mana your Shadow Fiend restore, right? So you're usually going to be pairing it with Fiend. The other big thing to mention about Mana Hymn in Cataclysm is that that percentage increase buff you get will stack with multiple Mana Hymns. So if you have multiple priests in your raid, if you like all Mana Hymn at the same time, you're going to get way more mana than you would otherwise. So that's something to keep in mind. Most groups don't have 2 priest healers. It's kind of a bummer, but if you do have like 1 or 2 shadow priests in your raid, try to get them to Mana Hymn when you Mana Hymn. Also, Mana Hymn will prioritize, let's see, right, so we have here, Hymn of Hope restores 2% mana to 3 nearby low mana friendly party or raid target. So that low mana thing there, this will prioritize the lowest mana in the raid. So try to use it when you have like very low mana and you will get more of those ticks, right? The problem with this is that like Ellies and mages are just randomly all the time in Kata, so they will steal like most of your Mana Hymn ticks, which is really annoying if you're a healer. So just be ready to like Mana Hymn and just only get like 1 or 2 ticks from it. Really cringe. The other thing to mention here is that you should always be fiending with a hymn. When you Shadow Fiend, if you can call for a second Lust, and your Shadow Fiend will get a couple extra attacks in with that second Lust if you really need that mana and you have like a shaman or a mage who's willing to do that for you. That's Mana Hymn. Let's talk about Healing Hymn next. So again, I talked about Healing Hymn with the Borrowed Time section. Just to reiterate it though, Power Word Shield before you cast for that haste. Try to snapshot it again with any kind of like haste or big procs. So that PI, that Zerk, that Power Word Shield, you should have like as many of these as possible. Your gloves, any kind of temporary effect that you can control. Try to snapshot into your Healing Hymn. You can also, on that Zerk and PI and like cast a bunch, and then with the last like global inside that buff, you can hymn and it will snapshot that haste. The other thing to mention here is I try to have your Rapture on CD when you hymn, so it doesn't sit off CD while you're channeling. Also, don't be afraid to send your hymn in an emergency. I usually have like a time during the fight where I'm planning to use my hymn as disc, because you usually only get 1 cast, so it's usually like, well, I'll use it at the end on Choke All, where there's like the big damage burst and everyone's going insane and there's a bunch of raid damage. But if before that there's like an emergency, I'll just send my hymn and I don't worry about it too much. Better to save people from death than to like have a perfectly optimal hymn. Last here we're going to talk about Penance. A couple things to mention with Penance. It does have a travel time and you should keep that in mind, right? Because it's sort of an instant heal, but it's sort of not. And you can also do things like on Maloriak, when the tank has that like 0 healing buff, you can actually cast a Penance like 1 second before the buff drops, and the bolts will travel through the air and hit the tank and instantly heal them when the buff falls off. So there's little things you can do with Penance there. Also, keep in mind that if the person's far enough away and they're really low, and you try to Penance them to save them, they can die because the bolts are flying through the air and they're still taking damage. So your Power Word Shield is like a much better instant emergency heal there. Also, canceling a Penance, if you do really have to move, you can wait for like 2 bolts and then cancel it, and it's not like the worst thing ever, right? You still get 66% of the value of the heal. You should also prioritize Penance a little bit higher if you do have that force set. The thing about the value of this though is that it's like not the greatest spell. I mean, it's not the greatest force set ever. It gives you 540 spirit for 10 seconds, which is about 700 extra mana. It's a little bit higher if you have like fully raid buffed and maybe you have a couple intellect procs going. It could be, a little bit higher than that, but really all it does is just reduce the cost of your Penance from like 2,900 to like 2,300. So it makes it a decent bit more efficient, but it's still not like the greatest spell, and the force set isn't really that valuable. It's not like the other, like, if you're playing H-Pal, you're playing Holy Priest or something, it's just free spirit for doing exactly what you'd be doing anyways. For disc, it's not as good as that, so just keep that in mind. But it does go up a little bit in priority if you have that force set. The last thing I'll mention is that Penance is very good at stacking up Grace. So one spell that only costs 3,000 mana is going to fully stack up this Grace. So that's like pretty valuable, especially on tanks, right? So try not to cast your other casted heals into the tank unless they have that 3-stack Grace. So that's like really the primary value of Penance is in stacking that Grace up and just being like pretty cheap, right? So it's decently efficient for low to medium damage on single targets. So those are my tips for Discipline Priest. Hopefully you've gained something from this. I know a lot of these things I, again, have mentioned in my various guide videos and various boss guides, but I figured I'd just put it all in one place. I might do one of these for the other healers as well, if people want that. Just, mention in the comments if you do. Thanks for watching.
Swobu! Zug Zug!